So some of the supplies you're going to need to get started on this project are, of course, your color wheel. The circle's out. I have all the sections. They're all labeled. This one does not have shapes drawn on it because I'm not actually going to be painting with this one. It's just an example one here. This is called a water well. The water well can be filled up as high as you want it to. It doesn't need to, if you watercolor, we keep this as a divider, this line right here, but it's okay if the water comes up and over. A couple things about the water well. There are two sides. The side with these parallel lines over here, that's how you actually wash a brush. You should hear a slight clicking noise when you wash your brush. You just drag the bristles back and forth. I'm not going to put it down and twirl and smash. That will make all the bristles spread out. We want them all really tapered, come together like this. So you drag the bristles back and forth. That cleans the paint out all the way up to the metal if you got paint up that high. Some things of not to do with these. I don't want you guys to put your paint brushes in these holes here. They get stuck, and then kids go to grab and reach for things and they'll knock this over, spill water everywhere. And then when they're stuck, you're trying to pull them out and this is full of water and it dumps and it's a disaster. So do not store your brushes inside these little holes over here. If you're not using a brush, just leave it on your table on a paper towel or something. Also, there's these little lines that go back and forth like this. That would be to soak a brush, but we do not soak these brushes. Their bristles will fall out, the glue that's holding them in becomes unstuck. Some of the other types of brushes, the paint chips off the handle. These are plastic, so nothing chip off. But do not store your brushes soaking like this. We don't need to store them here. Again, leave them just on the table. So that's the water well. If it starts to get too dirty, then you can dump it and get new water. At the end of class, you'll dump the dirty water out, rinse it with a little bit of fresh water, and flip it upside down in the dish racks for the next class. This is whenever you change your colors, you're changing from an orange to a blue, you're gonna need to wash your brush, dry it off, and then start painting. Do not mix any water into these paints. They're already very transparent, they're very thin. The more water you add to it, they're just gonna be ruined. So you need to dry your brush, that's why we have a paper towel, in between any changes of colors. So speaking of brushes, there are medium and small brushes, but even inside those medium and small, there's a lot of range of sizes, from really little, this one is called a 10/0, you have a little bit bigger, that's a 2, here's a 4, here's a 10, I'm sure there's a 6 and 8 in there somewhere too. So you have a range of brush sizes. Find what's comfortable to you. The bristles should be all together. If they're flared out like this, then somebody misused the brush. They should stay all nice and together, so when you're trying to make a line and things, it's not dragging these wide spread out bristles. So take about 2 at a time. You guys don't need all 4 of these. And if you don't even have really small detailed shapes, then you might not need this really small brush. This would be ridiculous if you had, let's say, the heart on here. You don't need that tiny little brush to get into those things. But for those of you that have more detailed shapes, then you do have that as an option. So again, the paper towel, you can use that to dry your brush in between colors. If you're spilling water on your table, you can wipe it up, things like that. The paints are all going to be labeled. I have an R for red. Here is red orange, orange, yellow orange, yellow, yellow green, green, blue green, blue, blue violet, violet, and red violet. If you're running out of color, let the teacher know. She'll pour in more paint for you, but those are your colors. When you're working, make sure the lid stays with your paint. Do not get the lids mixed up. Then you stay with the paint, and hold your paint cup really close to you as you're working. You're gonna see me talk about this later, but the paint is very liquidy and we tend to splash with this liquid paint. So I'm gonna hold it right here as I'm painting. I don't wanna be dragging across, or there's gonna be little splash marks all over your paper. Cap it and return it. You can only keep 1 paint cup with you at a time. You're not allowed to keep a whole little stash. I'm only gonna make 4 of each color. For my bigger classes, that's 12 times 4 is 48. So you cannot keep all those colors with you. There's not enough for them to go around. So use a color, cap it, put it back on the table, and switch to a different color. Alright, so this is ready to be painted. I have my 12 sections, 30 degrees. They're labeled out in order with the color wheel. From red, red, orange, orange, yellow, yellow, green, green, blue, blue, violet, violet, red, violet. And then in each section, I need a shape that is going to be colored in the complementary color. So you can start anywhere. I don't need to start with red, but in this case I am. You'll start any one of these sections. So I'm going to work with red. I know it's red because there's an R on the cap. If it had an RO, it'd be a red and orange. It had RV, it would be a red violet. But this is going to be a red. I need to keep my cap with the cup. And you can have 2 brushes, a small and a medium style brush to get in and around these sections. And the B behind my red section is going to be eventually painted in green, its complement, so green on red. And then the opposite side, I'm going to have a green section and the B is going to be painted in red. So I only need 1 cup at a time. I only need my red to start out with. I'm not going to collect a whole bunch of cups. And before you start painting, this is very big. I'm going to paint in my red section. Before I start painting, I have to erase that R. Now don't erase all of them because you'll lose track, but if you were to paint across the R, it's going to show through. This paint is rather thin. So I can start with either small or big brush, and I'm going to get just the tip of my bristles with a little bit of paint on it and start to paint in just this one section behind my B with my red paint. Notice here, I'm going to glide along my pencil line, not paint towards it, glide along a pencil line. I can rotate my paper if I'm getting too small. I can rotate my paper. I'm right-handed, so I like to pull paint going this way, not back this way. It's more comfortable to paint this way, so find out what's most comfortable to you. Paint right along that line. When I get in too close to my small sections and I have this medium-sized brush, I can just stop. So that's all I feel good with doing that bigger brush, so I can switch to a smaller brush and start to work into my smaller sections. If you have a very detailed shape, it's going to be a little harder to do. If you have an easier shape, it'll be a little bit easier to do. Okay, so that's the first layer of that red color. You can see there's kind of darker and lighter spots. Some of it's because it's wet, but also may need a second or third coat of paint. I don't need to be too careful about my outside edge because we're just going to end up trimming that away from the black paper, or sorry, from the background paper. So it's okay if it goes a little bit over the edge, doesn't mean it's super clean. I do want cleaner lines along the little triangle slice here and around my shapes. So next I'm going to flip, while I have my red out, I'm going to look at the opposite side. So in the green section, it's complement, opposite here. This time I need to paint in my B shape. So red is the background on this section, red is the shape on the opposite section. So make sure you keep rotating. Notice how I'm always rotating my paper around. It doesn't need to, I don't want you to drag your hand through anything. Spin your paper around. Also notice, I'm going to show you out here on this side, that you can control how thick of a line you're making. If you barely hit the bristles down, you're making a very small line, and the more you push, the wider it's going to be. So notice that if I'm just kind of getting a little bit of paint and I'm only hitting the tip of my bristles down, I can get into a smaller section. And as I pull and make a bigger section, I can push down harder and the bristles will flatten out and add more color. So this will, like I said, probably need a second coat. You can see here it's still drying, but there's lighter and darker areas. And I can't go back and paint my green immediately. That paint needs to dry. I don't want the red and green to mix. It'll end up making a brown. But once my red is completely dry, I could go on to green. But for now, what I'd actually do is just move on to a different section. Probably not anything right next to it, so I could skip over to maybe a violet and the yellow and start on that while my red is drying. Can't paint the green, can't paint the two colors next to it, they'll bleed together, but skip somewhere else and go back and hit the other part when you're ready for it. So my red is dry enough to paint in my green, and since then I've also done my yellow. I will give you a heads up. If your brushes are not washed correctly the last time somebody used them, they will transfer paint, and there's nothing you can do about it. You cannot glob up extra paint to try to cover it up. This paint's rather transparent. So one of my brushes had some black paint from somebody last year, and when I pushed pretty hard with it, a couple lines came out. I also noticed it when I was using my red. Thought I washed it out, but I guess I didn't. So here it is in my yellow, and that's just how it is. Nothing I can do about it. So I can either keep going with new colors, or I can go back in and work into my green. So I'm going to do that now. So my green will come here, and then it will be the B on the opposite side inside that shape. So before I paint in green, I erase that letter. And G is for green. If it has a BG, it's a blue green. If it has a YG, it's a yellow green. Just a G is for green. And I can just start painting. Okay, so that's my green section painted in. And again, you can see dark and light spots. It's partly because it needs to dry, partly because it's transparent paint and it will need a second coat. You can use big or small brushes. I would definitely consider the small ones if you're not familiar with painting so much. And but if you're in bigger areas, don't take that small brush and fill it in. Use the two different brushes. And I will go for my B over here in the red section. Okay, so another thing to be careful about, I always notice things as I work, is the paint is a little watery. You might possibly splash some color as you're working. So be careful, do your best to prevent that, knowing that, like I said, the paint's kind of liquidy, watery, can kind of splash around. But again, you can't take extra and blob it on and cover it up. The paint's too transparent to do that. So that section is finished with my first coat. I'll let it dry and see if it needs to go back with a second coat. And I can just pick anywhere else on here, not next to what I just worked on. I could go back in my violets, or I can move on to something new and just keep going.